When it comes to lockdowns and vaccine mandates, many of us, including myself, have very, very strong opinions. I'm currently living in Austria, where, as I am unvaccinated, I am possibly threatened with jail or most likely fines. Today on the show, we have a real intellectual powerhouse, Jeffrey Tucker, who founded the Brownstone Institute for Social and Economic Research. He's contributed to Forbes and was the editorial director for the American Institute of Economic Research. Whatever side of the conversation you're on, I encourage you to listen carefully to Jeffrey's intellectual arguments because ultimately you will learn something. Also, please check in the description for our supporters, Kevin Sorbo and Colin Heaton. All right, here we go. Hi, Jeffrey. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing fine. So nice of you to have me on your show.
Yes, it's been a pleasure. I know you're a very busy guy. Your time's in demand. But I'm just impressed with your work. You've written quite a few articles that are quite interesting, and it's almost hard to keep up to date with all the various different topics we're facing nowadays. But I just want to applaud your work you're doing and the boldness of what you're speaking out with.
Well, something my entire career, I suppose, has prepared me for this. I don't think I wanted to live in these times. I used to write about fun things, the way regulations break our technology, and a lot of writings on cryptocurrency and markets and how they work, and these kind of things. It kept me busy for decades. But yeah, the world fell apart March 20th. I'm sorry, middle of March 2020. And it changed everything for me and the world. And we're living unprecedented times, and we see states all over the world pursuing policies that have failed. Doesn't quite sum it up. And not only did the policies fail, but they created tremendous collateral damage and destroyed a generation of children and spread ill health all over the world. And we're suffering from a massive loss of liberty suddenly and shockingly for reasons that are still unclear. And we are not hearing the people who did this to us admit that they did anything wrong. Challenges to our liberties like we never, ever wanted to live through. It was a catastrophe. And looking back on precisely what happened and the unfolding of events is something that's going to consume us for years. And I write about what I learn as I learn it, basically. But almost every day I discover something new, and it's astonishing, and it's a complete shock. And the scandals and sadness are so pervasive in our world today. It's beyond description, sadly.
Some authorities appear to me to be wanting to defeat us by just wearing us down. I'm living in Austria a large part of the time, and people are basically out protesting most weekends because they are facing either they get vaccinated or they get fined or they go to jail. So that's even more extreme than it seems Australia, and it means that it seems like the UK is almost freedom loving compared to what we're facing in Austria right now.
Yeah, and it's hard to know why. Given the history of struggles against tyranny in that country, you would think that there would be enough historical memory there to prevent this kind of thing. It's not clear. A lot of times, Europeans say that the U.S. is a safer place because we have constitutions and the Bill of Rights and that sort of thing. We have a history of having an overt ideology in favor of individual rights, but the courts didn't protect us, and the Bill of Rights didn't matter, and all of that was of no relevance to Americans. We were locked in our homes too, and prevented from traveling, and our schools closed, churches closed, businesses shut down, hundreds of thousands of businesses destroyed. All of this happened anyway, and we didn't have the means to do anything about it. The courts are just now speaking out about it, but they're speaking very, I would say, like mildly and without a lot of principle. All this stuff should have been struck down the day after it happened. But the whole systems froze, not just around the world, but in the U.S., everything just froze up, and nothing worked. And all the systems that we had in place to protect us, none of them did that. So I don't think any country in the world is quite as free as it was 2 years ago. Maybe Sweden. I don't entirely know. And why Sweden? didn't pursue these policies, and so many other countries did. That's still unclear to me, also. So
Hmm.
we're going to be spending a lot of time sorting through all these failings, errors, and I dig through all the emails and all the research and read every book on the topic and trying to reconstruct a timeline of what came down here. And it's very difficult. There's so many missing pieces too. There's a lot we don't know also.
It seems like the groundwork is being laid for any future control mechanisms for any future pandemic to just be rolled out ad hoc. At the moment, people are sort of thinking, okay, Omicron's come along, it's a natural vaccine, it's that things are going to get better. We're going to be finally over this pandemic, but people don't understand that this has been an operating system that's been rolled out where things have changed, and so there will be a lot less resistance the next time there is a lockdown, and people are just being programmed to live like this. Obviously you've got those young kids from 0 to 6 that have basically that's all they've known. So it's a masterful plan, I think, really, if you're
Well,
inclined such way.
it's a little bit of a surprise. I have to tell you, 15 years ago, in the United States, there was a fear briefly for this thing called avian bird flu, and that was when George W. Bush was president. And he whipped up a big frenzy about it. He said, "We're going to have to lock down. We have to shut everything down. We have to deliver the food to people's houses with government trucks." And it was just saying crazy stuff. And and he held this big press conference at the time. And I remember watching it, and it was a funny moment because everybody knew he was a crazy person, so nobody was really surprised. But it didn't get much attention at all. This press conference, hardly anybody wrote about it. I think I was one of the few people to actually write about it. And I looked it up, and I thought, wow, they do have the power to do this. So the question is, I asked in this article, why why are they doing this? And my thinking was at the time that this was a few years after the Iraq War had begun, and the fraud of the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and the destruction, just the calamity of the war on terror was becoming very obvious to the American public, and there was a growing sense that the state was not doing any good for anybody, and so there was a legitimacy crisis at the time for public institutions. And I speculated in this article that there were someday they could use public health and a fear of germs as the basis for imposing a kind of a tyrannical despotism. And I said that I thought that this was their great new excuse. Well, that was 15 years ago. I didn't ever believe that it would actually happen the way it did, but I knew it was possible. The other thing I didn't entirely understand is the extent to which this is a good, compelling excuse for the state to grow. That people's primal fear of germs would kick in so hard, and especially among the professional, the Zoom class, which always imagines itself to be cleaner and healthier than everybody else, and somehow more entitled to a clean, healthy life. So once the people who could work at home uh, came to about a third of the American public, that seemed to be the time that they could do it, because they tried to do it in 2009. It didn't work. Nobody cared. That was the H1N1. 2006, the avian bird flu never went from birds to human beings, so they lost their chance then in 2009. And then, so then we had to wait another, whatever it is, 12 years or something. And once the virus came out of China, they deployed their lockdown strategies for the first time in history. There's nothing like this has ever been tried ever on the scale, and it didn't work. But we're left though with all this carnage, especially carnage concerning our liberties and our rights.
Hmm. So when you say it didn't work, some would argue that because China had such a strict lockdown, they were able to overcome the virus quicker. What would you say to that?
Well, they keep locking down. I mean, there was a lockdown last week, and then they open it up and they lock down. They lock. The other thing is that if you look at the data that China reports on cases and death, it's obviously fake. I mean, it's not. I mean, it's been flatlined for almost 2 years. So I mean, we don't have any information out of China, really. And of course, the Communist Party there is always going to claim everything they do is perfect. So, they just don't report any cases of death, and then that makes it really nice, and they can claim that their policies worked, but it's complete hoax. I mean, you can't actually do anything about eradicating a respiratory virus with an animal reservoir like this. It's just not possible. This is not smallpox, you will never eradicate it. It has to become endemic in the population, and our immune systems have to adapt to it. That's just the way it goes. And there was never any chance for zero COVID. But all the policies in the world were structured around this idea of minimizing cases, and it didn't work. I mean, what's fascinating? Well, I say it didn't work. It didn't. It maybe it worked in the short term. It's possible that the lockdowns actually did minimize or reduce the number of infections just because people were staying away from each other and not going to any events and that sort of thing. So it's possible that it did for a while, but all you're doing is, as they say, kicking the can down the road or just delaying the inevitable. And it becomes a problem for epidemiology because unless you deal with wild type, then you're going to get new variants and new variants and new variants. But with each new variant, the threshold for herd immunity, for endemicity, keeps rising and rising and rising. So under wild type, we may have only needed 30% of the population to be infected. I don't know. That's just pure speculation. But under the new Omicron, it's going to be 90% or higher. So with each new variant, it's weaker and therefore spreads further, and more people have to get infected. So in a way, lockdown policy has actually had the opposite effect over the long term, over 2 years.
What do you mean by wild type?
Alpha,
The
the
first one,
initial,
right? Yeah.
yeah, the initial one. Whenever that was, December 2019, I think
Yeah,
it's
that's the one that I had, and I was about a year and a half ago. But then I went and got tested for my antibodies in Austria, and I had really high antibodies,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm still looking at going to jail or something like that if I'm not vaccinated. So, or paying massive fines. So it's when it comes to Austria, it doesn't make any sense at all because you're basically radicalizing a bunch of angry people even more. And I
Sure.
think that these politicians, which I think are absolute cowards, the ones that I wrote to, didn't even bother to respond to me. And I'm actually emailing the embassy now, the British embassy, to see what they want to do about this, and saying to them, okay, well, what are you going to do about these British citizens getting thrown in jail, perhaps? But I don't even know, probably not even going to hear from them, but it's just strange because you think that if the government's going to throw a citizen in jail for not getting vaccinated, they might have something to say about that. But that remains to be seen. I've not heard yes or no from them yet, so it's only been a day since I
There's
contacted
so many moving parts here because when the vaccines came out, and I'm not sure what vaccines Austria is using or Scotland for that matter, but in the U.S. we had basically three. One was an old-fashioned vaccine where you get a little bit of the infection, um, uh, and and then the other two were mRNA technology, which was a kind of a new technology, newly tried. But the big promise in the early days of the vaccines was that the vaccine was going to pass on to you immunities that would protect you from infection spread. Well, after a year of experience, we know for a fact that that's not true. There seems to be no difference whatsoever in the infection rates. I mean, the only real question right now is whether or not the vaccine actually makes you more susceptible. Uh, but there's no question that it doesn't have any public benefit whatsoever. It might have a private benefit for people who are vulnerable, by whom I mean, over 75 years of age and probably with 2, 3, 4 comorbidities. In other words, the elderly and sick can possibly be protected from these things. I think that's what the research shows right now. But there's no real public benefit for these things. And I'm not saying anything controversial. I mean, this is widely admitted and widely understood. So, in other words, there's no basis for the mandates at all. It doesn't actually make any intellectual sense that you would mandate these things for the whole population. I mean, there's not going to be any public benefit from this, and a lot of, as you say, private anger. And the denial of natural immunity is one of the most unscientific things you could possibly ever imagine. So natural immunity is something we've known about for 2,500 years. And to suddenly wake up in a world where nobody wants to talk about it or think about it is an astonishing thing. And then at the same time, most of the vaccines, I'm not sure about the European case, but in the US, they were released under what's called emergency use authorization. So they weren't ever really, didn't go through all the testing. They were very quickly tested and they announced, oh, they're 95% effective. And so suddenly they were rolled out. But the neglect of therapeutics, things that help you get better once you're sick, it was really a shock. And I was looking at the website of the Food and Drug Administration this morning to see what they have to say about this. They're very clear that you can only get emergency use authorization for these vaccines if there are no other alternatives, no therapeutics available, right? So part of the reason for the neglect of therapeutics here is to make it look as if there is no alternative other than vaccination. So, and another alternative to vaccination would be natural immunity. So every alternative other than vaccination has been sort of blocked or not talked about or anything. I just don't see how it's a coincidence. It seems like this is all just sort of baked into the pandemic planning. It's a
So,
scandal.
what is your worldview? Are you a religious person, or are you just agnostic or atheist?
Well, those are difficult questions. I would say temperamentally, uh, very friendly to religious tradition and that sort of thing. I think it's has both personal benefit and public benefit. Yeah.
So, for me, it seems like I have a Christian worldview. So, I mean, you brought up with the Book of Revelation, right? So, there's lots of heavy duty things in that book that you probably are aware of. This prophecies about the mark of the beast and this world war government and all this kind of stuff. So, people like myself, we have a sort of vague belief in these things happening, and so, but we always sort of put them at the edge of our thought, like it's somewhere time in the future, because right now we're in the age of reason. We have had a long peace for 80 years or something like that. We are evolved in a sense of just we're good, better to each other. But when you look at what things have happened in the last 2 or 3 years, it seems like there's forces of chaos that are starting to prevail. It seems like there is a sort of orchestration that almost can't um, be arranged by just natural governments playing ahead in their evolving states. It seems like there's either what you call dynamic influence, intelligence influencing people, or just a group of eclectic world leaders intent on puppeting the whole world, all the world governments, world leaders, and things like that.
One of the things that, by the way, the world has fallen apart in the past too. World War I was this way. It was begun. Most states embarked on that war out of a precautionary principle. They thought Russia was getting aggressive, and so Germany armed up, and then surrounding states around Germany thought Germany was arming up, and so just kind of one thing played into the other. Nobody set out to create a 4-year long war with millions dead, but that's what happened. And something very similar happened this time too. A lot of states locked down because they saw a lot of other states locking down. So the U.S. Public health authorities sent a delegation to China in the middle of February and said, "Oh, how did you get rid of the virus?" Well, we locked down. Oh, that's fascinating. Okay, and then you had Milan locked down. And so the U.S. was watching that, and there's a lot of fake pictures coming out of both China and Italy at the time. And then Trump announced the lockdowns on March 16th. Well, he first blocked travel March 12th, and then blocked. And then a lot of states around the world followed the U.S. example because they thought maybe we knew what we were doing. If the land of liberty, home of the free and brave, was going to lock down, then it was okay to lock down. And then a lot of people fear the U.S. too. Like, well, if we don't lock down, they're going to cut off our money transfers. They thought anything could happen. So states all over Latin America, really all over the world, just I mean, states that had very little intervention in people's lives, like small islands in the Caribbean. Everybody just locked everything down under U.S. influence, and then once that started, there didn't seem to be any way to get out of it. Once the lockdowns began, then there wasn't a widespread admission. I think there's only two states in the entire world that admitted that there was a bad idea, to close the schools and all these kinds of things. So once that started, there was no turning back. The vaccines were supposed to save us, but once that became clear that that wasn't going to happen, then now we have the vaccine mandates in place. So it's just like one bad thing keeps rolling in to the next thing, and it's creating a kind of a World War I situation. That war lasted 4 years. It was only supposed to be a couple of weeks.
Yeah, and I
Very
think
dangerous.
what was that?
It's all very dangerous. And well, I'll mention one other thing. Um, I think that most citizens of the world imagined that they would have more influence over policy and states than we really have. I mean, we thought there was a kind of an integration between public opinion and how states operate.
Very good point.
Yeah, and we've discovered, much to our astonishment over the last 2 years, that this is not true. It doesn't matter. I mean, states all over the world, they just ignore the people in the streets. They ignore public opinion. They ignore their declining popularity. They just cling to each other, the bureaucrats and the deep state and the elected politicians. They just hold on to each other to figure if they're in this private club, they're doing the right thing, and they can just ignore people. And they're getting more brutal, all the time.
It seems like Austria is almost like a petri dish for the other European countries to sort of watch what will happen, because I think yesterday it was signed, something was done in Parliament to basically authorise this 1st of February mandatory vaccine, and then the fines start rolling out in mid-March. I think in Greece already pensioners are fined if they're several, like €100 a month or something like that.
Amazing.
But we are in a little bit of uncharted territory because people are basically have a gun to their head now, financially, and if they don't pay up, potentially they could end up in jail. But you have the protests in Austria are very large for the population size. You've got a population of I think it's like 10 million or something like that. But you've got like 40 to 50,000 people in Vienna protesting every week, and then you just basically go ahead with these policies. The sky's the limit on what can happen over there. It's powder keg almost.
Yeah, and one of the things we've never had experience with, so as far as I don't know, World War One might be a difference, but for the most part, we've not really lived through a time when countries we see as democratic and free are faced almost universally with non-functioning, collapsing states. Where they've lost the consensus of the population, and we don't know what that looks like. We've seen totalitarian societies in Eastern Europe and Russia fall apart. Just walk away from their posts and in a mostly peaceful way. So we've seen those, what regime collapse looks like in those countries, but we've not really seen what that looks like in democratic societies. Mm. So we may be on the verge of finding out.
Well, I think in countries like, it definitely seems that there's a polarization between the vaccinated and unvaccinated right now. I don't think the vaccinated people are going to get too angry if more and more pressure is put on unvaccinated. So it seems like there's going to be a class of people that are going to basically, those are the ones that are going to be mainly oppressed, and other people go back to normal. But what that normal looks like is quite scary. It's like big gov.
So that might be right, but I can tell you in the U.S. case that nobody has been vaccinated since, I would say, like August of last year, who really wanted to be.
Really?
And yeah, I mean, they were all forced into it to keep their jobs, whatever. to be able to go to restaurants. So they're angrier than the unvaccinated, because they had this potion shot into them that ultimately did not protect them against infection, since everybody's getting this thing now. So I would say vaccinated people are actually angrier than unvaccinated, at least in the US. So
Really?
they're extremely upset.
I don't know about Austria because everyone there just seems so polarized on whatever side they're in. Um,
Well, there's also this strange attempt to demonize the unvaccinated, and to otherize them and say, "Oh, you're not fit for the political community because you're dirty." But this is just an old scam that states play. They try to turn people against each other, you know, and it could be based on religion, it could be based on race, it could be based on language, on social class. But in this case, it's based on vaccine status. So it's an attempt by states to turn us against each other, so we'll stop noticing what they're doing to everybody.
I don't even like this word unvaccinated. I think it's a terrible word. There should be like I don't know, experimental subjects for the ones that have been taking this shot. You know, like spike protein holder or something like that, and just I don't know, because we've all been vaccinated from other things, but
I'm never
this is.
entirely minded. I mean, for the most part, I mean, vaccines have not been all that controversial. People want to get the smallpox vaccine. They want to get, they prefer to get the measles vaccine than get measles. Um, if something's going to be good for your health, you know it, and you're going to do it for the most part. You don't need mandates.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but with this vaccine, it's a lot more controversial. People just don't believe it. It wasn't well tested. It's not clear what the side effects are. We know for some population groups, the danger of heart disease, myocarditis, is actually higher for young men than the danger of COVID.
Mm-hmm. One thing that really annoys me is that, or frustrates me, is that we see some of these pictures of sports people having problems and things like that, but there's certain groups that I really despise that are using misinformation. You'll have like a picture that's from like several years ago, and they use that and they'll say something about like this guy took the shot. It makes me so angry. Really, these people, they're just clueless of what they're doing. Maybe they're doing it for a reason of freedom, but it really harms the cause of freedom because this is the sort of stuff that the mainstream media will pick up and basically demonize anyone who's got an alternative view. I just hate it, man.
Well, the propaganda is completely out of control, and it's not believable anymore. And it's also stupid. I mean, we can read. We've got access to information. Brownstone has been putting out information. Brownstone.org has been putting out information on this stuff since August of 2021, and we have 6 million page views, in excess of 6 million page views. So the information is getting out there, and people know. People are not stupid, but our governments are treating it as if we're all idiots and criminals. Yeah, we've never been treated so brutally. The other really interesting possibility is that we're in a kind of an in-between political time right now, so that you've got a lot of people in power that are going to be kicked out, that would be kicked out of power during the next round of elections. Certainly that's true in the United States. The Democrats are destroying themselves, and they'll be replaced by Republicans. But the question and so I think we're looking at some pretty big political upheaval in the future. But whether and to what extent that makes any difference is another question, because the people who did this to us are not very responsive to elected politicians. For the most part, they ignore them. These public health bureaucracies just think the elected politicians are clowns. They think they're in charge, and they're unelected, and you can't get rid of them. They have immense powers that the politicians have already given them. So getting rid of these bureaucracies and these little tiny tyrants, none of whom they implement these policies and they don't take any responsibility for them. But getting rid of them is going to be a much harder project.
Yeah. At what point did you think that there was problems with the responses to the pandemic? I mean, surely the first few months you were probably a bit worried, but then as more data came out and then lockdowns came out, I
Well,
guess
I
you're
knew from the very beginning that it was a catastrophe was unfolding. I mean, in the United States, it all began on March 8th with the cancellation of a major, major, major international technology and arts festival in Austin, Texas called South by Southwest. The mayor just canceled it. And I thought, wow, that's a shock. I don't remember anything like that ever happening in the U.S. where the government can just tell 250,000 people they can't meet. I mean, I thought we'd face 10 years of lawsuits from that. I wrote an article about it March 8th. I was the only one. I mean, I didn't see anybody else complaining about this. But, I always knew from the very beginning that however bad a pandemic is, uh, you have to have freedom in order to preserve social functioning, and in order to find cures, to discover therapeutics. The worst thing you could ever do in the case of any crisis really is to take away people's freedom and rights. So I knew this was a disaster. So I was writing against it. Well, I was writing against it since January of 2020, and then again in March, and then everything just unfolded. So, and as soon as Trump said we needed 2 weeks to flatten the curve, I knew that wasn't true because you could just look at the case data. It was rising exponentially. There was no way 2 weeks was going to change anything. And sure enough, after 2 weeks, they said to him, we need another 2 weeks. And then it was another 2 weeks and another 2 weeks. And he got frustrated by about about 2 months later, realizing that he had been sort of tricked, which he had been. He'd been tricked. But then he didn't know what to do about it and he couldn't stop it. It was already done. And his own health bureaucracy started ignoring him. I mean, it's actually an incredible thing. He would issue all sorts of edicts and commands and try to employ this person, employ that person. But there already the machine was operating. We really did, for a good part of 2020, operate with two parallel systems of government. One was elected and largely ignored. Doesn't matter what Trump was saying. For the rest of the year, everybody just ignored them. And then you had this separate. Uh, um, Anthony Fauci was the dictator, and these huge bureaucracies and machinery was already rolling and already hiring their own people and implementing their edicts and enforcing them, and nobody could do anything about it. I mean, it was a kind of a weird anarchy at the time where nobody knew who was really in charge. I mean, we Trump was ostensibly president, but not really. I mean, and I assume that was true in many parts of the world, but a lot of our elected politicians around the world have been steamrolled or really just intimidated into going along, no matter what their views. They're scared of this gigantic machinery of pharmaceutical companies, tech companies, together with public bureaucracies and nonprofits, all of whom became dramatically and wildly pro lockdown and pro mandate. And there's nothing elected politicians could really do about it. And a lot of these people are being blackmailed. We shouldn't forget that.
yeah, it makes not much sense to me why big tech, Facebook, LinkedIn, are really censoring views versus other views that are much worse in a sense. Basically you're writing articles about this alternative treatment or this statement that you don't agree with, people being thrown in jail if not vaccinated, and then actually I got deplatformed from LinkedIn for saying stuff, just sharing articles and giving my point of view. Why is it you think that big tech has such a vested interest in censorship on this topic?
Well, there's an obvious explanation, which they want to increase consumption of their product, which is so they want to keep everybody at home staring at the computers, and more people have real lives to live, the less they consume their information from them. I don't. I think that's a good a good starting explanation, but I don't think it explains the censorship. So that one I don't. I can't really account for the corruption of LinkedIn, really, for example. I mean, like why LinkedIn's, you're living in times where people are being thrown out of work all the time. So the purpose of LinkedIn is to help people find, uh, to network within their professional realm and find new jobs and reach out to new contacts and that sort of thing to protect their careers. So you've got people being fired all over the world for under the vaccine mandates or because the businesses are failing or whatever. And you complain about it on LinkedIn, you're very likely to get your account taken down or your post blocked. So they're not even achieving, what they ostensibly set out to achieve. So I don't entirely understand it. I mean, I really there's something going on here. There's a lot going on here that I don't understand. Um, Now, LinkedIn is owned by Microsoft, as I
That's
recall.
correct, yeah.
Yeah. And then, of course, we know where Gates stands on all these things. So there is that. I'm not sure if that's a full explanation, though. Then you have, the problem of Amazon, um, which did so well during the pandemic, delivering groceries and that sort of thing. Uh, but Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, which was editorializing in favor of lockdowns for 2 years. So they were lobbying for lockdowns also. Then you have Twitter and Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg volunteered, stepped up, wrote Anthony Fauci that he was glad to turn over Facebook to the cause of lockdowns. A lot of these companies believed that what they were doing is the right thing, because they thought, this must be good public health practice. And we have to get everybody rallied around the same cause, without thinking critically about the subject. So it might have been just they thought there was the right way to block posts that were contrary. Maybe they just believed that this was true. In that case, it's an intellectual failing, less than a conspiracy. But it's really hard to say. But still, it's a shock because we thought these platforms believed in, more or less, in free speech. They wanted information out there. We thought they favored science and debate and their users' interests, but now all of them, almost all of them, are being used as tools of for the public health bureaucracy and the pharmaceutical companies. It's depressing for me. I mean, I wrote probably 3 books, celebrating all these platforms and their great contribution to humanity and so on, and then they just turned on me. Uh, these great platforms that we thought were so friendly to our interests and used to run a technology program. So I assume that you are a little bit of a bind also, but I had defended these people and celebrated them, and then to just have them turn into mouthpieces for government, is something I never expected.
I wonder if like your influence grows large enough on a platform like LinkedIn, that the algorithm flags something up, and then you have some person who has an ideology in LinkedIn comes and looks at you more closely and decides whether they agree with your ideology, and that then you basically fork off. Either you're deleted like myself, or you're allowed to continue up this merry road, because I know several people that once they got a certain level of influence, and they weren't even posting about COVID, they were posting on other topics, um, and they just got deplatformed on it. So,
Well, it's hard to know what the methodology is, but I used to have theories that on Twitter that they wouldn't care what you said so long as you didn't say it to too many people and your account was small. But that turned out not to be true because some people with 10 followers just you say one wrong thing and then suddenly they kill you. I've got almost 100,000 followers, and for some reason I still survive. It's a little embarrassing to me. I don't know why they
on
haven't.
on Twitter or LinkedIn,
Twitter.
Twitter 100,000. That's.
Yeah.
I find it really hard to get followers on Twitter, but in LinkedIn I was getting lots of followers. I don't know why on Twitter I get hardly anything. Seems like a harder platform.
It's very difficult. But so the way authoritarian regimes work is that they have a deliberate policy of not being consistent. So it's like arbitrary. Sometimes people get thrown off for tiny reasons, and you wonder how could that be true when there's all these other people that are saying even things far more extreme, and they continue to live. So I think that's the purpose. That's how authoritarian governments work. There's a certain arbitrariness, since the goal is not so much to shut down all contrary opinion. The goal is to make everybody really afraid,
Mm-hmm.
so that you self censor, so you don't say what you really think, right?
Yeah,
So that way they don't have to enforce it. It's not naturally automatically enforcing. People guard their words for fear of being deplatformed,
mm-hmm.
and then that's how you get everybody to comply. It's not so much by um, beating people over the head with clubs. It's scaring people about the possibility that
That's
arbitrarily they're
absolutely
going
it.
to hear a door knock at the door in the middle of the night, and or wake up the next morning, your Twitter account's gone. You just don't know, so you play it as cautious as possible. In that way, they can gradually come to enforcement over the entire population. It works.
I think LinkedIn definitely has to be one of the worst platforms now, because you just don't know. I had so many people on LinkedIn contacting me saying, "Keep doing what you're doing because I'm afraid that I'll lose my job," or something like that. And myself, as
Yeah.
an entrepreneur, I have several streams of income, and so I'm not dependent on just one client or one company. I have enough that I can, turn my hand to other things if I need to. And I won't say everything's been easy; it's been hard for me as well. Probably, I wouldn't say it's LinkedIn. It's not having LinkedIn. It's not helped me that much. I have lots of contacts outside of LinkedIn, but basically, LinkedIn, you have to really control what you're saying, because LinkedIn is always watching you, ready to find an excuse um, to so you don't fit your agenda. So basically, if you're on LinkedIn, um, you're in a sense supporting the regime just by being on there and posting, posting what the narrative should be instead of supporting your real thoughts.
Well, and there's also people forget this, but there are many, many employees at LinkedIn themselves that can, profoundly object to these policies, and they've tried to help me and my friends, where we get our posts taken down, and they write me and they try to appeal it to the whatever. Some really top people at some very large tech companies are financial supporters of Brownstone. They've been very generous with me because they like what I'm doing, what I'm saying. So these, I mean, maybe even a majority of people who work for these companies don't approve of all this stuff, but they go along with what their managers say, and their managers go along with what their corporate bureaucracy says, and the corporate bureaucracy goes along with what the government bureaucracy says, and it just kind of keeps rolling forward in this strange way. I mean, there's no question that if you had mass noncompliance today, that the entire COVID regime would fall apart. But that's exactly what all these policies are designed to prevent. They want people to be afraid to engage in kind of non-compliant activity. And so in most parts of the world, the people who are out on the streets are in some ways the people with the least to lose, because they don't have big corporate jobs, right? So it's like a class thing. Um, Certainly in Australia, that's true. I mean, most of the people on the streets protesting are working class people. The professionals are just hiding, trying to hold on to their paychecks and trying to be silent.
Yeah. Interesting what you said about this Zoom class. Now, I myself would class myself as a Zoom class. I've worked remotely the last 6 months, but doesn't mean that I feel any animosity towards. Uh, I don't feel I'm special because I'm using Zoom, because I'm an IT programmer. I'm one of the tech people in a sense. You could probably class me as the same kind of people that work in terms of big tech companies. I love software engineering, but I wonder why I feel so different to a lot of the views from big tech. And so I'm just rambling on. What is this Zoom class thing that you put out there?
Well, so we don't in most Western democracies we haven't thought about class distinctions much, because we try to create societies where there's a lot of fluidity between the classes. Uh, Working class can become professional class can become working class. You know, so we don't have a lot of consciousness of this topic. But when the lockdowns happened, they clearly divided us between essential and unessential. between elective surgeries and non-elective surgeries, between people who could have their businesses open and those who couldn't, right? So the states around the world split us into classes. And and you had a kind of a strange impulse at work among the people who can work at home. They were glad to take a break, glad to work in their house shoes, and didn't worry about it. They didn't care as long as there's somebody out there that can deliver them the groceries. They didn't care. Most of these people don't go to church. They don't care. They don't care that the churches are shut down. Um, the schools were kind of a different issue because a lot of these people had children and their schools were closed. And that was a catastrophe, especially for women workers in the US. It seemed like a third of women or something had dropped out of the workforce for like a year because they had to take care of the kids at home. It's just something incredible. But there was this kind of sudden class divisions between the working classes and the professional classes. And the professional classes were very inclined to want to stay safe from the pathogen. They wanted to stay. They didn't want to get COVID, and they're glad for everybody else to bear the burden of herd immunity out there. You go out and get COVID, not me. You get it from me. You create herd immunity, then I'll be protected. That was the attitude. Very, I would say, like medieval in that sense. So the pandemic lockdowns really exposed the existence of these class interests that are, for the most part, invisible to us. They suddenly became extremely visible, and they divided us according to our interest. Now, in a normal kind of free society, a functioning society, um, we don't normally turn against each other in kind of brutal ways, right? We like the people who deliver the mails. We go to the restaurants and engage in banter with the waiters and the bartenders and that sort of thing. We don't think about the divisions between us. But with lockdown, suddenly we became profoundly aware of who was who. And this survives to this day in the United States. In most parts of the country, I would say most right now, the wait staff and the servers at restaurants and bars are all wearing masks, whereas the patrons are not. So it's a very visible illustration of the difference between us and them. So it's corrosive for a well-functioning society to have these kind of demarcations like this. Like I say, it's medieval. I mean, there have been whole social structures created in the past around this idea of clean and unclean, touchable versus untouchable, and those have persisted for centuries and centuries. But in free democratic societies, we long ago kind of adopted a bit of a social contract concerning infectious diseases, that we would share the burden equally, regardless of race, class, language, religion, but that we would protect the people that are most vulnerable, which are typically the elderly and the frail. And we do that because everybody gets old. So it doesn't matter what class, race, religion you are, everybody's going to get old. And so this was the idea that we would protect the old. Everybody else would meet the virus, meet the pathogen, develop immunities, and we'd move on with life. And that's what we did. That's what we did for centuries until the 21st century with this new strategy of lockdowns, which split people up, divided people up according to those who deserve to be clean and those who deserve to confront the pathogen. Then we added insult to all the people, the working class people, particularly in the medical system, that bravely confronted the virus in the early days, got immunities, and now we say, well, now you have to get vaccinated or else you're going to lose your job. So that's a brutal policy, and it makes no sense.
There's no sense. It's like trying to argue with Satan himself, trying to logic about just good and evil. Don't do that. That's wrong. But then there is no argument for just. I mean, these old people, they should have been protected more.
Yeah, in the U.S., there is a policy of deliberately infecting old age homes. They put COVID patients in them. They forced COVID infected people into nursing homes all throughout the northeast of the United States in the early part of the pandemic, causing tens of thousands, if not more. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of death was caused by that decision alone, and the nursing homes had no choice. It was a law. You had to accept COVID patients in there, and it just spread through and wiped out people like a fire. It's just, I mean, yeah, we could talk all day about these scandals. I mean, I'm sure it's very similar in Europe
Mm.
because the policies were very similar all over the world, actually. Something unbelievable.
It's an interesting word you say, the law. And also reading one of your articles recently about, Elon Musk, he said a statement that just shocked me, and I'm still haven't decided exactly if I agree entirely with what he says. He basically says governments have monopolies on violence or something to this, to that extent. It's the biggest corporation. Do you agree with that? What he said?
Yeah, I think it's an old style liberal conventional wisdom from liberalism in the late Middle Ages. You know, we discovered this that states were different from everybody else because they have access or recourse to the legalized use of violence against their populations. I mean, whatever's wrong with LinkedIn or Amazon, they don't exercise that kind of violence. They don't have that coercive codification of the coercive power over their populations. And I think that's what worries Musk the most. And it's what's always worried liberalism. That's why we've tended to restrain states because they're just dangerous. They tend to abuse that power, and once they start doing that, we don't really have the ability to stop them because because they have the guns and we don't. And that's why we limit the power of states. We're living through a great illustration of why we work so hard for so many centuries to restrain the power of states. But one of the things that states have learned is that even when they're restrained, if they can convince private companies to do the same thing that they would like to do, then they don't have to obey uh, uh, constitutions and bills of rights and traditions and things like that. Because the private companies don't face those kind of limits. So that's what we saw in the US. I mean, most of the enforcement um, of COVID policies have come from private institutions that are working on behalf of governments. And then it also goes the other way. Then private companies then lobby governments to implement things like vaccine mandates to increase the consumption of their product. So it's like a symbiotic relationship there between large corporations, big media, big technology, and big government.
Yeah, at one point during the pandemic, I was trying to source new business, and I actually had an offer to work with those kind of testing companies, and I was tempted by the money. I was tempted, and to my own shame, really, and I just consulted with one of my friends. You know, one of the guys I respect a lot, and says, "What do you think about taking this work?" And he's basically says, "You want to take money from the enemy?" And I just says, "Yeah, I couldn't live with myself." I felt, I, it's that's the trouble when you're under pressure. You can sometimes do things that you're outside of your ethics. So that's why we need to have people in our circles that we can ask for advice for, because the money's there. And it scared me really, to myself. I learned something about myself there, but thankfully I made the right decision, and just even though it was hard at the time, I said I'm not taking that cash, to do this, to work with
Yeah,
this stuff.
there's a lot of people who've gotten very, very rich during the pandemic. Whether it's the testing companies, the pharmaceutical companies, the mask makers, uh, you know, the big tech companies. It's been an incredible transfer of wealth from the working class to the high end professional class. And is that the reason for these policies? I don't know if that's the reason for them, but that's certainly one of the effects of them. And I really wonder what the future is going to look like here too, because um, are they going to have to give all this money back? No, it's already a done deal. The vaccine manufacturers, their products haven't been effective in terms of stopping infection spread. Do they have to give back all their earnings? No. They're never going to be held liable for the damages they've created because they're exempt from that sort of liability in the law. So there's going to be, I would say, like years and years and years are going to go by where people were going to gradually discover that we were all tricked and that none of this worked, that it caused enormous damage and transferred trillions, tens of trillions of dollars from our pocketbooks to theirs. And now we have inflation, which I don't know what's going on in Europe with inflation, but in the US it's really bad. So the money that people have left is all being, the purchasing power of that money is going down. We have shortages of goods in the United States with shortages of labor, and it's all intensifying.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thanks very much, Jeffrey Tucker. It's been an absolutely fascinating interview. I appreciate your time today. I just wonder if there's anything you want to leave our audience, any way they can find you, or any thoughts in general.
Yeah, I leave my messaging on my Twitter account open, but I also have a Getter account. My email is all over the website. The website is brownstone.org. Be really appreciative if any of your listeners went and subscribe to the emails. I send out about one email a week just to remind people of articles that we're publishing, that sort of thing. Sharing the work, republishing the work, translating the work. That's what we're here to do. So, and I always take recourse to the fact that, we all feel very, I would say, powerless these days, but we're not. We do have information platforms that we can get things out. And there are curious people out there reading. As I say, 6 million page views on Brownstone alone. So we have the means to speak. We have the ability to change minds. And it's the only way. It's only going to, once the pressure comes from below, we'll change these policies, but not a day sooner.
Okay, well, thanks, Jeffrey. Appreciate you coming on the Nikos show. And we'll keep in touch. And be this global chessboard that continually evolves every day. We'll keep a watch at it. Thanks for your time.
Okay, my pleasure. Thanks so much.
Cool. Thanks.